Good evening and welcome once again to Plain Talk. Over the past several weeks, there's been a lot of discussion and conversations about slowdown of the economy, tax concessions, and measures the government should take to galvanize the economy. So I thought that I'll have two economists discuss these matters with us. They are Dr. Maurice Odle, or Maurice Odle, and Dr. Thomas Singh, both eminent economists, and both of them on the Tax Reform Committee appointed by the Minister of Finance to look into the taxation system. So this evening, the two main areas we will address are the economy and tax reform. So let me immediately introduce our guests, Dr. Maurice Odle, to my immediate right, and to his right, Dr. Thomas Singh. Gentlemen, welcome to Plain Talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
We hear a lot people saying the economy has slowed down. Now, to the trained economist's ear, what does that mean? An economy has slowed down? Anyone of you can start.
Maurice?
The economy has slowed down based on facts and figures. There's a view out there that the economy has slowed down. It is being substantiated by emerging facts and figures. What has happened is, since the middle of last year, let's say, with the fall in gold prices, with the proroguing of Parliament, and then with the fact that since the beginning of this year, spending was statutorily reduced, right, because of the lack of a budget. Then, of course, we had a situation where the budget has actually been passed, but that is after about a year of the beginning of the slowdown process. The budget, I think, will create something of a stimulus, right? And there's also the seasonal effect coming up. Christmas is on us almost, and I feel that we will see a beginning of pickup as far as the economy is concerned. But I would say there is perceived a slowdown, and there are means.
There is perceived from in whose perception? Is it your trained economist perception?
There are figures that are beginning to emerge, right? Which suggests that there is a slowdown. The business people, based on what is happening in the retail sector, feel that there is a slowdown, and they are talking about this perceived slowdown, right? What I think will happen pretty soon is that we will see a gradual pickup of this economy.
All right, we'll get to the picking up, but let's talk about the slowdown.
I was about to say that in an economy where we really don't have data, where we cannot say, for example, that quarterly GDP has increased or decreased, where we can't talk about unemployment and sales, that sort of thing. We have to look at the indicators. We have to look at the things that would have been the drivers of the economy. Maurice has mentioned a few. Government spending has been a main driver of the economy, and for political economy reasons, there has been a reduction in government spending that will experience a stimulus with the new budget. But there are other things as well too. Rice markets have been creating problems for us. There's been a significant overproduction of rice, but the sale of rice to Venezuela is not something that we could be concluded the way it was. So rice is now a difficult sector, is experiencing problems. Sugar, of course, continues to experience problems. Maurice mentioned gold, and the price of gold is trending at, is it about $1,200 now?
Less now.
Or less now. So all of our gold exports are not earning as they used to. Declarations would be down as well. So on most of the fronts, our commodities are doing poorly. What has been buoying our economy is that the price of oil has been low and continues to be low. So if we were to look at the things that have been driving our economy, clearly there is good reason to believe that there has been a slowdown. Maurice mentioned that the retail people who first experience whether or not there is a slowdown have been reporting that there is such a slowdown, and we have to take that very seriously.
There are, I believe, some objective measures that economists and statisticians would use, such as the money in circulation, the value and composition of imports, the fuel imports itself, since fuel is used in so many sectors. How are those measures looking?
Well, you'll have to go to the Bank of Ghana bulletin, half-yearly report to get figures on those indices. There is, in a sense, a feeling that the volume of money in circulation, right, is trending down. But there is something that the economists refer to, right, which talks about the rate of spending in the economy, the multiplier effects and such like, which would indicate that perhaps there is a slowdown, but there are no concrete figures yet emerging.
Absolutely.
Right? So we just playing with intuitive feel of what is happening in the economy. But there are measures that are available to the central bank to stimulate the economy. They can try to pump more monies into the banking system, and at the same time encourage the bankers to lend more to would-be credit-worthy borrowers. So the regulators of the economy are not without, I would say, mechanisms for assisting the economy in this stimulus process.
Thomas, you see Bank of Ghana having a role, given that Bank of Ghana has two principal statutory roles: price stability and exchange rate maintenance. Does Bank of Ghana have a role in stimulating the economy?
The Bank of Guyana is the agency that conducts monetary policy in the economy. The normal textbook thing is that if an economy is experiencing a downturn, if there is a slowdown in the economy, one of the things that must be considered is the lowering of the interest rate, especially if the interest rate is already high. In many parts of the world, in Asia, the interest rate had been low for quite a while, so lowering that interest rate didn't do anything.
Lowering by whom?
By the Bank of Guyana.
Can Bank of Ghana tell a commercial bank?
No, not by direction, but rather by
Moral suasion.
moral suasion as well as open market operations, so to speak. If the Bank of Guyana wanted to lower the interest rates, it would have to do what's called increasing the money supply. In other words, then, it would have to conduct open market operations, basically putting more money in the hands of the commercial banks, buying treasury bills that the commercial banks might have. The sale of treasury bills.
Treasury bills, but treasury bills belong to the government.
No,
Treasury
but
bills are issued by the government.
Yes, and many commercial banks have invested heavily in treasury bills.
Yes.
So the normal practice is either to buy or to sell treasury bills to influence the money supply. So when the Bank of Guyana purchases treasury bills,
That is purchases back from it.
purchases back, it actually pays, therefore, the commercial banks with money from their reserves, and that increases the money supply. An increase in the money supply, therefore, the banks, from its balance sheet and accounting perspective, will have to decide we're not earning from treasury bills. We therefore need to lower interest rates to try and get people to borrow more. It's a signal, and it works with demand. The banks would themselves lower interest rates so that consumers borrow more.
Have we had any evidence of that? We are told there's considerable liquidity in the system in terms of money supply. There are more deposits and deposit funds available to the commercial banks than there are demands for loans, and yet the rate of interest seems to be stubbornly over 10%.
Yeah, that's a traditional conundrum. The fact that we have excess reserves, right? You would expect the banks to perhaps try to on-lend some of those reserves, whatever, in order to maximize their profits. But the banks are not risk takers.
They're not risk takers, and they have an easy option of buying treasury bills.
Right? So in that sense, you find that we are not perhaps lending to the full extent that is required. And the banks, you talk about the interest rate. Economists have always been talking about the fact that the difference between the deposit rate and the lending rate in commercial banks in Guyana is pretty high.
Absolutely.
It's also high in other parts of the Caribbean, but in Guyana in particular, right? It is high, and there's always been concern that we should do something to reduce this spread, this interest rate spread between deposit rate and lending rate in order to stimulate the economy.
Well, we've said the Bank of Guyana, in fact, doesn't have any statutory powers to do so. It could use moral suasion, I think, is the term you use.
Or open market operations,
Or open.
the purchase and sale of treasury bills.
But, so therefore, why has our central bank not done that? And over the past, well, it might seem a very long time ago, since we had a government-owned bank, why has the government not used its own investment in a commercial bank and control to bring down interest rates when it could have done so?
The governments are trying to get out of running productive enterprises, and therefore the governments have gotten out of the banking system.
No, so why doesn't it use its what do you call it? The
Regulatory
moral
authority.
suasion. Moral suasion.
I'm told that there is a lot of discussion with the bankers, that the central bank does have discussion with the bankers. But as you know, the bankers have a virtual oligopoly. There are just a few banks in Ghana, just a few banks. And they can have a lot of collusion going on among themselves. So there is a problem in trying to bring down the rate in that fashion.
I also think that we've inherited something from the IMF program under which we were, and that program itself came about because of the problems we had earlier on. It is this obsession, it became a policy obsession about too much spending in the economy. And if there is too much spending, including investment spending, then that might spill over into a current account deficit and a balance of payments. The IMF is terribly concerned, remains very concerned about the current account and balance of payments. Now, we have inherited that framework, and many of our policy makers, almost as a knee-jerk reaction to things, they operate in that framework still, where there's a great reluctance to do anything that will allow spending to grow. I mean, let's face it, in pre-1989 days, a large part of the problem was fiscal profligacy, a lot of government spending, and on the whole, just a lot of spending that spilled over into current account deficits. Fiscal discipline was reintroduced after 1989 in the IMF program. But I don't think that we ever saw that with the fiscal discipline reducing the size of the budget deficit, we ever allowed investment spending to rise too much. Because if government spending came down and investment spending, private sector investment spending, rose to compensate for the decline in the government spending, we're back to square one in that equation that relates spending to the, or more particularly the so-called investment savings gap, to the current account deficit.
That's important because foreign exchange is our Achilles heel. And we have a very high propensity to import. So if you have stimulus, right, by whatever means, it's going to be reflected in a reduction in our foreign exchange reserves via the current account deficit. So central banks are very cautious in terms of, in this part of the world, in terms of their stimulus activity.
And the other thing too is that that's an excellent point, Maurice. The other thing too is that I think commercial banks will probably say to us that it's sort of like the Berbice Bridge and the tolls. If we were to lower interest rates, there is no guarantee that there will be an increase in the demand for loans. One of the reasons there might not be an increase in demand for loans is probably the very taxation that we're thinking about. Maybe there is good reason for investors to be reluctant to take risk in our particular economy. So we have to look at not just monetary policy, but an entire package of policies if we were thinking stimulating our economy. It would not be good enough to just say to the Bank of Guyana, increase money supply so that the banks lower interest rates, unless we could feel fairly comfortable that there will be an increase in the demand for loans.
You're an academic. You spent a lot of time. You spent.
I apologize for being an academic.
Not at all. No. I was getting to this point. Because you would have studied the empirical data. Is there evidence, if you were to do a time sequence, that the money supply influenced the interest rate within the Guyana context? I'm not asking for a theoretical answer now. I'm asking you for practical observation and experience.
I have to say, that is a specialized area that I know very little about. So I really cannot answer you. I know that there are people who've done that sort of research. In the case of the Berbice Bridge, I don't think that sort of research that has been done, where we could say lowering the rates will definitely cause this particular increase in traffic, and that sort of thing can be done. We might have a very good gut feeling about it, but in the case of the monetary sector, so to speak, and monetary policy, a lot of work has been done. I just don't know much about it.
One of the great economists of the 20th century, Lord Keynes, he was very keen on situations where you're in this position, an economy is slowing down, there may be various negatives and externalities, I think you economists call it, about the economy, and you should try a stimulus package. Should we be following the Keynesian model now?
The Keynesian model arose within a particular context, right? Between an economy like Britain in a depression. Britain also was an economy in which they had a lot of control over the operations of the economy because they were a developed country. They didn't have the foreign exchange constraint, balance of payments constraint that we have.
But they had
Now-
the same problem. They had with the sterling and all of that. The sterling was under pressure, the pound sterling.
Pound sterling was under pressure, but the pound sterling at that time was a very important international reserve currency.
No, but isn't-
It wasn't easy to move away. It's only post World War II that we moved away from sterling.
Yeah, but
right, to the
isn't it
US
true?
dollar.
Isn't it true that the Keynesian model is now beyond where it started, and it's regarded as a model to be considered in any given, in particular economic situations?
I would say that the Keynesian model is still a very valid model. If you were to be reading what the commentators have been saying with respect to the 2008 recession, right? They've been saying that one of the reasons why the United States and Europe took so long to come out of that recession is that they were not following the normal Keynesian precepts.
And the textbook recommendations.
And
you know,
recommendations.
It's Paul Krugman said it through the textbook.
Because of this hostility to increase government activity.
Yes,
They were
that's
all
right,
just
that's right, that's
concerned with minimizing government. That was the mantra, minimizing government.
And
that
it's
was the
interesting.
base.
So is Keynes relevant again now?
I was about to say, though, just for the listeners who are trying to follow here, we started off with the Bank of Guyana, and that is known as monetary policy. The Bank of Guyana and the central banks in general can undertake policy, but monetary policy to influence interest rate and stimulate an economy. Now you've shifted, and we're actually talking about Keynesian policy, which is primarily fiscal policy.
Yes.
And in that regard,
Which
it's
is
either
spending,
government
yeah.
spending or taxation, by the way.
Yeah, yeah.
So I just wanted to make that intervention, a small intervention. As you were saying, however,
Well, no. My question is: should Minister Jordan be considering the Keynesian model to stimulate this economy?
I tell you what Minister Jordan should be worried about, and I suspect he is worried about, is that our economy, like several other Caribbean economies, have been largely driven by government involvement in the economies. We've had a very large government sector. And that's traditionally the case in Guyana. So if that is our natural trajectory to have big government, then certainly the Minister of Finance, being an economist and a good economist, wouldn't automatically consider bigger government. I'm sure it's that sort of concern that will be going through his mind as he considers Keynesian type mechanisms. On the other hand, the tax system can actually stimulate the supply side of the economy and private sector
That's by
activity.
reducing taxation.
That's one of the things it could do. It could also make it easier for the private sector to undertake risk and that sort of thing. Reduce the uncertainty and the unpredictability of taxes, many such things.
You know, I must interject perhaps a point of levity here. You know, some of the worst jokes you hear are about lawyers. You hear jokes about accountants. We hear about economics being the dismal science. What does it mean about that? Or is it the pessimism that's being exuded here this evening?
We criticize by many people because we always say on the one hand and on the other hand.
Or you have too many hands. I think that's one of the problems.
Because we're dealing with an entire economy, and everything is related to everything else. We were talking about monetary and fiscal. They're related.
That's right. That's
You know?
right. That's right.
When you have an increase in
Well, you have to come down at some point with something. You can't keep theorizing and bothering. Okay, yes, an economy is several moving parts all at the same time, and you have to consider. But there are economic models here. You know, I mean, economics itself has matured into quite an elaborate science. apart from being a dismal science, which you're trying to sidestep.
And the dismal science doesn't only obtain to the Guyana economy. if you look at what's being debated in the USA at the moment, or Canada, or the US,
In defense
or
of
UK,
economics.
you'll find these same problems.
I think in defense of
conflicts.
economics,
But-
we've actually gone beyond what would have been considered our natural boundaries, and have begun to embrace things in what's known as social economics, actually, that go beyond what monetary policy should we undertake, what fiscal policy should we undertake. There's some exciting researchers at MIT working with what's known as the Jalil Abdul Latif Poverty Action Lab, conducting lots of field trials and that sort of thing, who actually emphasize things like reducing the cost of doing business. That's a traditional one. The new thing is giving people hope. Giving poor people hope, for example. Let's take GPL, Ghana Power and Light.
And you're saying that gives hope?
I'm saying that precisely because people are so hopeless about GPL, this sort of research would point us in a particular direction. GPL complains a lot about its commercial losses. As I've been sharing with you, if one were to go in to pay a bill at GPL, one sees several signboards saying all the things that are required before one can have a connection, a legal connection. You have to have either a transport, or you have to have an agreement, a tenancy agreement with a landlord who has a transport. So for many people, it makes absolutely no sense to even think about getting a legal connection. If one were to go the route of the formal requirements, having a legal connection would be a wish, an exercise in futility of the mind to have a legal connection. People at MIT and elsewhere are saying, make things simpler for people to do. Give them hope that it's possible for their children who cannot right now read, even though they might be teenagers, to actually begin to read. So we're operating at different levels in economics, and what I'm suggesting is that at the level of the mind and mental models and institutions, there's a lot of theorizing and thinking and research going on that can be tapped into as we look to move our economy forward.
Mr. Jordan, and what you should do to stimulate it. Come on, gentlemen.
He's got to rebalance our economy.
Could you please?
Yes.
You know, something we haven't spoken about, only tangentially when we're talking about the size of the economy, is the level of debt within the Guyana economy. A few months ago, we were what 60% of GDP, something like that, right? My feeling is that we should not be hung up over this business of government, you know, and small government or whatever, right? We have a situation in which we have to provide for the people out there. We have to maximize employment. We haven't spoken about employment, some of these social objectives. We haven't spoken about any target rate of growth, right? We've been talking about constraints.
Let me come to that, because implicit in what you're saying, and I may be wrong, is that you're saying forget the size of government. Who finances government? And if you're talking about protecting the fundamentals, the current account balance, the financial balance, imports, exports, where does this money come from if you want to promote big government? If you see government as the provider of employment?
What I'm saying is government has certain objectives and it has certain obligations, and government must make a conscious effort, right, to try to arrive at those undertakings that is given in terms of its manifesto or agenda or what have you, That is, in order to provide employment for the people. And
Is it the government's job to provide, or is it the government's job to provide a framework?
A framework.
provide employment via stimulating the economy and via its own infrastructure and facilitation work, right? To put the economy on a much faster growth trajectory, right? Now, we have a situation in this country, by the way, in which we've been told that oil has been found in commercial quantities. We've been told that in 4 or 5
Or
years.
hydrocarbon, no? Yeah.
We've been told that in 4 or 5 years, this oil might be actually see the light of day in terms of coming on stream, whatever. A government has, in terms of its strategizing, have to consider whether they will want to now exercise the various options in terms of stimulating the economy with the expectation that down the road, there might be sufficient foreign exchange flows and a sufficient revenue in order to be able to service that debt that is going to be increased as a result of that activity. There's no debate about that particular strategy, and I think that is something that really should.
So you're saying, anyway, Thomas, let me hear you, please. And we were talking about big government versus small government.
Yes, but we could move beyond that because.
No, I want to hear your view on it. Don't move beyond it.
Very well. I mean, it's all right to make it black and white like that, because if government, for example, were to, as Keynes would have suggested, engaged in and financed the sort of infrastructure that
But you pointed out earlier that in a particular set of circumstances, in other words, where it is necessary to stimulate
I was about to say,
situation.
suppose one of the Ghana's biggest constraints in exporting goods and services, goods rather, is the cost of shipping. If government were to ensure that we have a proper deep water harbor, shipping costs will go down significantly. Exporters will find that they are significantly more competitive. Their goods and their exports are significantly more competitive. Now that is government spending. It might have to be with private sector, public-private partnerships. But if the government were to say, we will finance and construct a deep water harbor, that could itself stimulate this economy. Government has to. So it's not that straightforward, but it's not that difficult. If we wanted to be serious about exporting services, we do have to reduce and also make more, improve the quality of our telecommunication services. Absolutely no question. Can government do anything about that? Most certainly government can. The telecommunications bill is intended to do that. So there are things that government
there
itself
as a
can
facilitator,
yes,
rather than an investor.
Well, when it comes to a deep water harbor, government might itself, and I think we have to look at this. Government might have to figure out what it wants to do. Let me pause and say that what government chooses to do, it must be very careful about it. The Skellon factory is a classic example of a decision that went wrong. That was probably a wrong decision in the first instance. The Berbice Bridge was only feasible because the toll could have been $2,200 for cars.
Or because it was put partly in private hands.
No, it is because the feasibility study showed that the bridge was feasible as long as those tolls could have been charged. Now,
to provide a return to privately
so it was feasible. It was feasible
privately
at
provided
that
funds.
There. That's
yes.
right. And what facilitated it was the creation of a monopoly by cancelling the ferry service and so forth. Government did that. Government committed government funds, NIS funds. It's very easy for government to commit taxpayer dollars to things. But if the feasibility study is not
anytime you're talking
done,
about government money, you're talking about taxpayers' dollars.
Taxpayer dollars, absolutely. So I'm saying that, yes, we could easily say government should do, but government should do carefully and choose carefully what it should do. And government should be absolutely careful in how it spends taxpayer dollars. The feasibility studies must be properly done.
Let's switch specifically now, rather than tangentially, to this tax reform committee, of which you, Mr. Dr. Odle, are the chairman, and Dr. Thomas Singh, the vice chairman.
And of course,
we
you remember, you ought to disclose these things.
One of the principal objectives of the committee is measures to reduce the tax burden on the poor. Why should that be such? Is that an economic objective or is it a social objective?
It is both.
Absolutely.
Yeah? It's a social objective in terms of its welfare effects. It makes living a bit more bearable for the poor, right? The goods and services would be more obtainable. At the same time, it's an economic category, because the less taxation on the poor, the less burden on the poor, the greater the productive effort on the part of the poor, the greater the capacity to do various things. So, for example, a poor person whose tax burden is low might be able to provide for the children, might be able to send them to school, and such like. If the burden is so great, then there's a multiplier effect. You won't be able to do anything for his children, and the next generation will be poor.
Do we have...
So it's both. It's both social and economic.
Before I ask Dr. Singh to come up with to give us his take on it, is there a definition of poor in Ghana? In other words, a poverty line where you say this person, because I think that's what you economists would consider poor. You fall below a poverty line and you've got different gradations of poverty.
Just as monetary policy is a very specialized area, poverty has become incredibly specialized. And people actually, specialists actually earn a lot of money from studying the poor and designing all these measures. I say that, but it's a very serious comment. If one were to attempt to talk about poverty, it's rather risky to venture into that area as someone who is really not an expert in it. Bottom line, I work with the poverty line. Now, if you might allow me, I'd just like to elaborate on something that Maurice said regarding productivity, however.
But you haven't answered my question about the poor, because we're trying to discuss around certain accepted concepts.
Well, for me, it is those who live under the poverty line.
And what is that poverty line?
Right now, I honestly do not know
Okay,
what the poverty
okay.
line is.
All right.
Right? Maurice, I don't know if you know what it is.
This notion of poverty, right, is a relative term,
There is relative poverty, absolutely,
It's
as
a
against...
relative term. There are international norms
Yeah, but
as to what constitutes
if there is an
poverty,
objective measures to reduce the tax burden on the poor, you got to know who you're talking about.
No,
it's
you
not,
have to know...
It's not some invisible... yes, it's a group, it's a collective.
Yes.
But collective with certain common characteristics.
So it's very simple. We want to ensure that the poor and the vulnerable, I think the word actually uses vulnerable, isn't it? In the terms of reference. But anyway, it doesn't matter. The tax reform effort can easily target the poor without actually being able to say that these are the people who are poor. For example, if we were to recommend very simply, and this is an interesting one, the zero rating of items that we believe are consumed by the poor. I mean, one can argue that that is reducing the burden on the poor.
But it might also be that it's not the poor at all who benefit from those zero ratings.
Exactly. Now, these are the technical issues that this committee really will be addressing. So, for example, there is the argument that the poor, and this is an argument that was made in the Duke report that we're using, that the poor do not participate in formal markets. They buy goods that have been smuggled into the country and that sort of thing. That is how they sustain their livelihoods.
Or from unregistered...
unregistered entities.
Businesses,
Businesses. So if you were to zero rate the items that they would consume, it's not benefiting them in any way at all. And these are the technical issues that the Reform Committee is actually addressing.
The level, in terms of Guyana, we tend to use a poverty rate of 40%. In other countries, in the Caribbean, I see they use 30%, right? 30% of households, whatever, are poor, whatever.
And consumption of a...
Yeah. My feeling is the important thing is not the absolute figure or even the relative figure. It's the rate of reduction of that degree of poverty over time and how effective our policies have been, right? And there's a lot of debate as to whether we've been sufficiently targeting the poor in terms of our revenue measures, in terms of our expenditure measures, in terms of our direct measures, that we have not been doing a very good job in Guyana. But the poor is a category that exists whether we like it or not. People are poor. And we know when people are poor. You just have to go around and observe. We know people are poor.
Guyana's taxes are high. We have very high tax rates. And you can imagine, just from that the poor suffer under this system of taxation.
But when you're talking about taxation is the means by which the government raises revenue to undertake public expenditure. And the larger the public expenditure and the bigger the government and all of those things, the more expenditure it has, therefore the more taxes it will need. Where do you find that sensible balance? Because people continue to ask for more.
Yeah.
We talk about stimulus. What people don't understand, and this country unfortunately has ignored, is what you economists call tax expenditure. We don't measure tax expenditure. All the concessions and all the
waivers
and waivers and holidays that are given away annually. Those
exemptions.
Those constitute a significant strain on our economy.
They do. You mentioned revenue and mentioned expenditure, and we tend to look at these categories as separate. But the more government expenditure there is, the assumption is that the more the economy benefits, and therefore the tax revenue that is going to occur, the increases that are going to occur down the line, will actually eventuate. That is the assumption we make when we say that we want the government to do X, we want the government to do Y, that there is going to be a revenue impact, a positive revenue impact.
But isn't that the problem? Because what you're saying can't, if taken to its extreme, would suggest that all the government has to do is spend more to get more revenue. That can't make sense.
No, we're not saying
so
that.
You have to be able to target.
That's right.
You have to have two reasons. One, to generate further revenue, and two, to meet social objectives.
And if the tax reform is a successful tax reform, I think that we will safely see that our economy will grow. And it might grow in such a fashion that the relative size, not the absolute size, but the relative size of government is smaller as the private sector, if you will, gets larger. Now, that alone, I mean, the actual absolute size of government might grow. But what could happen if our economy grows, therefore, is that tax rates can come down and still the government revenue, the tax revenues could actually increase as long as our economy grows. The idea is to ensure that our tax reform enables growth in our economy and expansion of economic activity. There are equity concerns as well too, but there are also growth and efficiency concerns.
But as I think both you gentlemen eminent economists did say that these are moving parts and you're not sure how one will affect the other. Let's move away from the technicalities of your committee. I'm sure there's a lot of work you have to do. You have some very ambitious objectives. You have very tight deadline to produce a tax policy that not only meets the economic and social objectives of the country, but that gets popular acceptance, and popular acceptance meaning the poor, the business community, labor,
women,
the
gender issues. I mean,
Okay, well, we are tackling the problem. We've started, as you know, by making our role and our function and our activity known to the public. There was a notice in the newspaper, right? We followed that up with trying to make contact with stakeholders. We made contact with various types of stakeholders. We made contact with the business sector, the labor sector, the consumer sector, those people who are experts in this game, ex tax officials, etc.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
We have done that work. Our next stage is to have our consultations after we've gotten submissions as we've requested from the public and from the various stakeholders. After we've gotten those submissions, we intend to have consultations in which we will discuss the issues. So we're trying to have a maximum buy-in to this process. And the next stage, of course, is for us to do the analysis, to do the work, to capitalize on work that has been done before us. We have to update data and information on the particular activity. And then we have to produce a report. We are going to produce an interim report, right, which has to be done by the end of this year. So we are certainly making every effort to deliver by the end of this year, because it has to fit in. That report on tax reform has to fit in with the next budget cycle. So
you're assuming that your recommendations will be accepted to go into the budget.
That's the assumption. That's your motivation. Otherwise, you won't be able to work.
Right. But let me say that hundreds of, not hundreds, more than 100 letters would have gone out to various stakeholders, and we have urged the stakeholders to make submissions. I think many people might feel it less cumbersome to come to a consultation and speak to us. I think Maurice did say that will happen as well too. But for those people, especially those who have institutional frameworks and institutions like banks and so forth, all people who received letters, we're asking you to acknowledge and also to send us written submissions. It will help. These are very serious requests.
Well, I think no one can deny the virtue of having sent out over 120 letters. I think that was the count. As of today, I think it's 127, and that's excellent. In terms of consultation, I don't think that type of consultation has ever taken place in anything.
Well, we're looking forward to the responses.
Yes.
We've started to receive some really significant responses from a few people.
Well,
and
go on.
And we expected there'll be more, but we ought to say that we have been receiving responses, and we look forward to more.
Well, I don't think, and I'm probably speaking as a member of this committee now, if persons, this is an opportunity. It's
Absolutely.
obviously not the only opportunity. It's an important opportunity. A new government in place after 23 years has publicly pronounced on this. Minister Winston Jordan has practically staked his reputation, his professional reputation, on this. This is clearly a major opportunity for people to
Fantastic
see.
opportunity,
Absolutely. It's your Article 13 and 149C that you have a right
Absolutely.
to be consulted. I know you people are not politicians, but you're showing how Article 13 should operate. But, and there's always a but, persons have heard this mantra: we have to reform the tax system. We've heard it for 23 years from the PPPC. Yes, they introduced value-added tax, and that's probably, if you can call that tax reform, where it increased the share of GDP that's collected. What assurance do the people have that this exercise is going to lead to tax reform?
Let me just say that tax reform is not an easy exercise, but it's a necessary exercise from time to time in terms of governments having base to do something about the revenue structure because of the changing nature of the economic structure, right? In the sense of the different outcomes that are occurring. They may need to have another look at the revenue structure in terms of its impact on different sections of the community and in terms of the overall tax take, etc., etc. So this is an exercise that is necessary. This exercise, of course, you cannot, with mathematical certainty, say that this exercise will please everyone, right? Because in the sense, when you make allowances for certain sections of the population, let's say the poor, the revenue has to be gotten from other areas. So it's not always
expenditure has to be cut.
Or expenditure has to be cut. So it's not always a win-win. Normally, we want a win-win situation, but it's not always a win-win.
No,
That's
but
at
my-
the individual level, but at the aggregate level, this is win-win.
Win, right?
Definitely.
But my question was this: that people, Guyanese, have heard for decades we're having tax reform. We heard Mr. Ramatar when he came in, I think 1 month of his election, he appointed a tax reform committee. So people have become cynical. How do you overcome this cynicism?
I'm not too sure that people have become cynical about tax reform because taxation matters so much to people. And I think people...
But they haven't got it.
They haven't gotten it, but they perk up. I perked up when I heard that there will be tax reform. I'm sure the business community is very happy to know that there will be tax reform because of the overwhelming taxes that people now pay. So I believe that despite the cynicism and the false starts, the matter of taxes is of such significance to us as individuals, as an economy, that people will take this seriously. Apart from that, we're working to ensure that we get robust responses from people. I want to mention that we're working with an excellent study by 2 institutes at the Duke University, where the tax system has been reviewed comprehensively, and Minister Jordan has actually asked us to work with that report. So from all of these reasons, I would say that people wouldn't remain cynical at all. We have to work to ensure that there is buy-in. We cannot guarantee that all that we come up with is politically acceptable. But when people make submissions, those submissions would be hard to ignore.
One of the features of submissions in the past has been a mere wish list. We want this, we want this, we want that. In other words, we want tax reduction. How would you how can you cope with that if you're saying that if you want to maintain your macroeconomic stability and keep the economy strong, your exchange rate in some kind of under control, how do you make sure that you don't lose revenue whilst your expenditure remains the same? Does tax reform mean that somebody's going to have to pay more taxes?
Tax reform, with tax reform, we have to perhaps try to ensure that the revenue impact is not reduced significantly. That it is at least neutral in terms of its tax take. Otherwise, we are going to find ourselves in a difficult situation if it is that we want government to undertake various capital...
The same level of expenditure.
The same level of current and capital expenditure. We're going to find ourselves in a bind. So there has to be some balance.
There has to be balance, Maurice, but I think it's worth saying for people who are listening that currently Guyana is regarded as a lower middle income economy whose taxes are higher than average. I think as a percentage of GDP, Guyana's taxes are on average for those low middle income countries very high, or tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. Now, that percentage can be reduced, not by reducing taxes alone,
by increasing
GDP. And an important concern of ours as a tax reform committee, and I said this before, is to ensure that GDP, the economy, expands. We are not forgetting that goal. So while we balance things, we balance them in a framework that ensures that our economy after tax reform is not the same economy as it was before tax reform. For example, a consideration that we have to take on board is how taxes affect labor supply and people's effort. Clearly, we cannot grow as an economy if people don't want to work, if people tell themselves that it makes no sense to bother working. So we have to take that general context on board. The other thing I'd like to say too is that tax reform is not merely about revenue versus expenditure at all. There are goals of tax reform: efficiency, ease of administration, reducing cost of administration, equity, and there is this nice thing that we talk about when we talk about efficiency. It's known as the deadweight loss or the excess burden. We are being guided by these goals of tax reform and taxation.
I think a point that needs to be made, we talked about the 127 letters having been dispatched. There is absolutely no reason why anyone listening to this program or otherwise who wants to make a submission, to make that submission care of the Ministry of Finance. No one is excluded. No individual, no organization, no company is excluded from this process.
What I might add to this, though, Chris, is that we as a committee decided that we do not want people to feel nervous about making submissions to the Ministry of Finance. The fact that, people have to make submissions to government might be a deterrent. So what we did is we created a new email address. And that email address is taxreformgy@gmail.com. So people can reach us directly.
And they will be further asked.
I can say this quite clearly, that the Minister of Finance is anxious for tax reform to happen. He's given his clear commitment that we have, and the public needs to know this, he's given a clear commitment that we as a tax reform committee operate independently of the Minister of Finance and the Ministry of Finance.
Closing comments? 30 seconds.
We have a big exercise, challenging exercise before us, and we are soliciting the cooperation of the public at large,
Absolutely.
stakeholders at large, and we intend not to disappoint by the end of this year.
Anything
Absolutely.
you want to add, Thomas? 30 seconds.
Nothing else except to see that I endorse what Maurice would have said there. We urge you to communicate with us and to send in those submissions, though we shan't be waiting on them.
All right, let me say thank you very much, Dr. Thomas Singh, Dr. Maurice Odle, and of course thank you so much to our operators this evening. It looks like we have an all-female team this evening, and of course we'd like to thank the viewers for sharing this past hour. Plain Talk, as you know, is shown live on Wednesday evening at 8 p.m. and it's rebroadcast 8 p.m. on Channel 9, and it's rebroadcast on WRHM on Sunday afternoons at 5:30. All that's left for me again is to wish you a very good night and see you next week.